So today's guest speaker, is Carmen Cauthen. She has a very long resume, but I'm going to just give you a real short one. She is an activist, historian, and 30-year career at the North Carolina General Assembly in the House of Representatives. And she has many, many stories that she will share with us today. Welcome, Carmen.
Thank you. Thank you, all of you. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen and get started because I put a lot of stuff in my slides and I want to take us not longer than an hour. So I'm going to talk really about the economics of Raleigh's historically Black neighborhoods today. And I'll start here with this first slide. The picture on the top left is a rental house that's considered affordable housing in Raleigh. And it's still being used, and you see it. The picture on the top right is the Mordecai House at the Mordecai Park. Picture on the bottom right is the streets for Walnut Terrace when it was originally created. And the lady on the left, I do not know her name, but this was in the 1950s, and she's just standing on her front porch. So it's hard for me to talk about race and its history in this area without talking about my own story. So my history actually starts in 1958 when my parents got married in November, and they rented a room in a house on Oberlin Road. This house is no longer standing. There's an apartment complex there called Trilogy that just opened last year. They moved out. They lived with my grandparents for a couple of months. And when a vacancy came at Washington Terrace, which was built in 1951, it was the first apartment complex for professional Blacks, they moved in there. Then they moved to this duplex on Southeast Street, which has now been converted to a house in the last couple of years. And we moved to Durham, came back to Raleigh. My father was a pharmacist, and he had a drugstore in Durham, and that was destroyed by Hayti when he was part of Hayti, and it was destroyed with the building of Highway 187. When they moved back to Raleigh, they moved to Idlewild Avenue, which we'll talk about a little bit later, and then to Sandia Drive in 1968, actually 1969. They were the second Black family to move into an all-white neighborhood off of Ridge Road. And there were all kinds of rumors when we moved in. The first one was that there was a Black family moving into the neighborhood with 8 kids, and the property values were going straight down. This move came after they had looked for a house for several years. My mother was one of the first teachers to help desegregate the school system here in Raleigh. The teachers desegregated first, and then the students. And when they would go to look for a house in a white neighborhood, they would be told that there were no vacancies. The houses had been sold. So when she called this gentleman about this house, she told him that we were Black, and he told her that he didn't care as long as their money was green. So when we moved in, she had heard the rumor. She got her station wagon and filled it up with all of my cousins. And so 8 children came in the house the first day we moved in. And she made that rumor come true because she was a quiet fighter. And that's kind of what she taught me. You just do what you got to do and keep moving. They lived on Sandia Drive for about 40 years. And when they retired, they moved to a condominium at Oaks at Bentley Ridge. When I was in college, I moved to the Cameron Village Apartments on Daniel Street. When I first got married, I moved to Carver Street. and this house is no longer standing because this is one of the houses that was purchased by the city. The city had about 50 some houses in the College Park neighborhood and sold them for redevelopment for what is considered affordable housing. But houses are generally a couple $100,000 and up. In 1991, we moved to Latta Street, which is in the Oberlin community. It was a completely Black community then. I moved out last July. There are maybe 10 Black families still in the Oberlin community. And if we were sold this house by our landlord for tax value. At that time, tax value was $65,000. Today, you can't buy a house in that neighborhood for less than $500,000. And today I live on Battery Drive in Battery Heights, not in the National Historic Register part, but this is a Black neighborhood that most people do not know exists, back off of Pool Road. And these homes were built with certain specifications because the owner of the land was Bartholomew Gatling. He was a racist and he didn't want to sell his land to Black people. But because Black people lived in the areas in front, he wasn't able to sell that land to white people. So he made the decision after conversations with a contractor to sell his his property to professionals. And he personally interviewed each professional family before he was willing to sell them the land. So that's my history. And I love this quote: if you don't know history, you don't know anything. And in America today, we're struggling with what our history is. And the quote that I have is that my history is our history. So I can't erase my history, and nobody else needs to either. All right, I talked a little bit about housing during slavery, and I get a little frustrated with the city of Raleigh because we don't identify Mordecai House as a plantation. Durham identifies Stagville as a plantation, but we have prettied up our things. And so when you consider that Mordecai House was part of the Cameron family's estate that was over 30,000 acres of land, stretched from Raleigh through Durham. They had estates, plantations outside of Atlanta and Louisiana, and they were the largest plantation east of the Mississippi, owning over at least 900 slaves. So this house was a gift from the Benahan Cameron to his daughter and son-in-law Duncan. This house here on the bottom right is the Cameron house at Stagville. And this house on the left is one of the slave houses. So the Oberlin community in Raleigh, excuse me, was begun by free people. And some of them were former slaves from the Cameron plantation. But Jesse Pettiford was a freeman from Virginia, and he worked for the Camerons and was able to take money that he made from them and purchase one of the first lots that became what we consider Oberlin today, Oberlin Village. And I'll talk about that a little bit more. The Village District, which is now and was Cameron Village Shopping Center, and the Cameron Park community, which name has also been changed, was named for the Camerons who owned that land. I'm going to go way back in history now. So in 1792, when the city of Raleigh was established, it was established in a 1 mile radius, and the 1 mile streets were north, south, east, and west. Raleigh was characterized as being crisscrossed by creeks and watersheds at each corner of the city. And as a result, high hills, long ridges, and dank bottoms characterized the terrain. So antebellum residents didn't live down where those creeks and watersheds were. They wanted to live up high. And the reason for that was not just because it looked prettier, although that was part of it, but it was healthier to not live where the water ran down, where the sewage was, where the industrial plants were. So those were things, the low-lying areas were for industrial development, or they lay vacant. And after the Civil War ended, those were the areas that were divided as part of the selling of estates they were divided for lease or for rent to the formerly enslaved people who came into town. So that begins to show you why Southeast Raleigh is full, most all of these crosshatched areas were where Black establishments took place. Oberlin was the only one that was high up, but it was outside of the city boundaries. Notice the Capitol is here, and there's a mile boundary around there. Okay. So there were Negro jobs, literally that's what they were considered and called, and they were for menial and low-paying work. They were unskilled mill and railroad labor, although if you were working with the railroad, you could make money. Domestic service, road gang employment, but the people who tended to make the most money right out of slavery were those formerly enslaved people who had been barbers or draymen, hauling things, carpenters, brick masons, stone cutters, harness makers, people who had a specific skill on the plantation could set up shop and make, because those were things that the plantation owners didn't do. They didn't know how to do. So even though Blacks were interspersed among whites throughout the city, most of the free Blacks tended to live in areas that, as I showed you before, and so that was where segregation came, along racial and economic lines. During slavery, slaves could be hired out, and sometimes they were paid. The owner would receive pay, but the slave was also allowed to receive pay, especially when you consider stone cutters, people who helped to build the Capitol. They were able to make some money, and they didn't necessarily live on the plantation because it was too far to get back and forth to work each day. So they would live out in other areas of the city. So where the settlements became, they would also be areas where Black leaders and middle class would grow. And so there would be churches and schools and good-sized homes in those areas. By the 1890s, 50% of the Raleigh population was Black, and there were solidly segregated neighborhoods that surrounded the city. And white folks in the newspaper articles considered that it was racial claustrophobia, that there were too many Black people moving amongst the streets. And so they began to annex areas. So there were, by the mid-1880s, there were 9 Black churches, and there was 2 wards within another 10 years, second ward and fourth ward that were predominantly Black. And those areas included the graded schools, the Black churches, one of the 2 Black colleges, the Masonic Hall, and the Institute for Colored, Deaf, Dumb, and Blind. So those areas were called suburbs. And the city commissioners felt like it wasn't morally, people weren't doing the things that they expected them to do. And occasionally there were still white laborers who lived in those areas, but as soon as they could afford to move out, they generally did so. The reason we started the annexation process was to control the people who were not desired. And so that was the Black community. So there would be poverty because there were limited housing options. And the pressure of whites to keep blacks out of their neighborhoods ended up requiring that most blacks live in the worst part of the cities. Sometimes that was because of water drainage and flooding, and there was tuberculosis in the city because the sewage was in the streets. So it wasn't necessarily a healthy place to live if you were in the city and living on the back of someone's business. So when I'm talking about that, if you're familiar with Stronach's Alley is downtown Raleigh. If you know where the Pope House is, it is right beside the Pope House. A lot of times when you read the city directory will spell out that the person living in this address had a paren C, which meant colored, and it would say an address and then an R, which meant they were living in the rear of someone else's property. One of the things that one book that I researched said that the people who lived behind businesses or hotels lived in what was considered filthy, narrow places with open sewers. They were breeding grounds of disease and crime, and they were areas that were only fit for cattle. This caused for high mortality rates because if it's a breeding ground of disease, people are not going to be able to live. They didn't have street lights. They didn't have fire protection. If there was streetcar service, it was a long wait for it. Let's skip on. Oh, down here, this last paragraph. The Democratic Party at the time actually paid people in the third ward and the fifth ward to not take people in as renters to keep them from gaining voting majorities, since there were already Black voting majorities in the second and fourth wards. So it wasn't just, it was political and social. This is a map from 1886 showing the housing patterns. And then you'll see the crosses, the Black crosses are where the Black churches were. The white crosses are where the white churches were. And these little things are the public schools. And at that time, there were two colleges, as there are today. There was Shaw and St. Aug. St. Aug started out as a prep school. Shaw started out as a college. And part of the reason we're really fortunate that we had Shaw and St. Aug, because the middle class, the Black middle class, grew up in between those two schools. And so that's why there's such a large area of middle class housing and in that area. So we've already talked about half the population was Black in the 1890s. Between 1868 and 1901, Blacks were a very active presence in governing the city. There were city commissioners. There were one of the assistant police chiefs was Black. Third and fourth ward were Black, and that was Southeast and Southwest Raleigh. One of the books that I use a lot for research, and so do quite a few other people, is called The Urban Negro in the South. It was written by Dr. Wilmeth Carter, who was a professor at Shaw University. And she did amazing research, literally just interviewing people in the downtown area and in Raleigh in the late 50s and early 60s. And she says that the large cluster of Negroes was because of the colleges. So the other piece was there wasn't complete segregation because whites and Blacks were often neighbors. So you'll find in some areas that Blacks lived on one side of the street, whites lived on the other. It wasn't really segregated, but it sort of was. If they could afford to buy, and then they did. So the evolution of Black neighborhoods, we had 13 settlements in total. This map is from, I believe it's from Richard Matson. And it is the downtown area map of Freedmen's Villages. It's Carl Larson's book, map, I'm sorry. So the 4 Black neighborhoods that started in Raleigh, well, I say in Raleigh, but they are in Raleigh now. They weren't at the time, are not pictured on this map. But the first one is Lincolnville, which was in West Raleigh, close to Carter Stadium. So back where the parking area is, in between Carter Finley Stadium and the place that I can't think of the name of, the arena, that was Lincolnville. That land was sold or taken by the state and was supposed to be used for the prison and ended up being given to NC State. Brooklyn was started as a Black neighborhood, and it was near Devereaux Farm and St. Augustine's. Masonville is what we know today as Method, and it's about half the size that it was at the time when it was started. Method originally went almost all the way, it went across Western Boulevard all the way down to Avent Ferry. Oberlin was the first settlement started by free people, and that was in 1858. So there were 9 areas that settlements had started during Reconstruction. And so let me show you, here is New Bern Avenue. So this area is Hungry Neck. This area is Idlewild. St. Augustine's College is over here with no marking. Idlewild and Cotton Place were one plantation at one time, John Cotton's plantation, and New Bern Avenue divided it in the middle. Old Fairground was across from there where the area where the DMV, the old DMV building is today. St. Petersburg, and we don't know how it got its name because it just was in and out quickly. And then Smith Haywood, and then Watson's Addition, there were 9 parcels in Watson's Addition. So if you're going down Lenore Street, almost all of that land from Lenore Street up to the memorial, the cemetery for the soldiers, that was all Watson's land. He had a huge farm area. Hayti was near Washington School. It is not on the map. Cannonlands was near on one side of the railroad near Washington School. Manley Homestead was on the other side of the railroad near Washington School. And Wilmington Blunt, as you can imagine, was the Wilmington Blunt Street area. It's a little closer to downtown. I think it's easier to picture things when we have a map. So this was Lincolnville, this area in yellow. The church is now on Highway 54. The original church, which came out of Ephesus Baptist Church, it was Ephesus Baptist Church's original church. It was sold to the Lincolnville AME Church. They took it apart piece by piece and carried it to where it sat. And then it is now, if you ever go to the Village of Yesteryear at the fair, and there's a church on that property, on the property there that's open for people to rest in, that was the original Lincolnville AME Church. Method is in this area here today and actually went, as I said, went across the highway. This is something out of Dr. Carter's book. Oberlin used to be a colored community, whites around the outskirts of Oberlin, but they were poor whites. Everything was Negro. And because of that, nobody bothered about us. The city wouldn't even fix up the streets or give us lights or anything else. In 1960, there wasn't a white person on any of the property. Then whites began to pay high prices for the property and tried to run the Negroes out. Later, it was incorporated as part of the city. Now, not 1/8 of Overland Road is colored. That was the most desirable property in Raleigh, for it overlooks Raleigh. Whites would pay them good money for it. That's why they sold it. One fellow got $50,000 for his property. This excited the others. So that kind of goes along with what I was saying. When I lived on Lattice Street, when we first bought there, it was still a Black community. Overland community actually went from Hillsborough Street all the way to Glenwood Avenue. The area where Wade Avenue has cut through, that was part of urban renewal, and it took out a community that was part of Overland called San Domingo. So this was Overland, all of this stretch here. These were the other areas, Cannon, and you won't recognize any of these streets. I think Jamaica Street is still, Jamaica Street is still here, but all of this area was taken by urban renewal in the late 60s. So Manly, the railroad, Hayti, and I believe Washington School would probably be right about here. So these show the changes in Manly and Hayti between 1945 and 1961. So this is a bigger, this is spread out a little bit more, but you'll see the changes. There were more streets in that area. Often when urban renewal came, was a part of, and urban renewal kind of started in the 50s. The federal government made plans and gave away money to clean up or improve areas. The original intent was that the people could move back into those areas, but because there was nobody saying that they had to do that, they would say that they could, but it didn't happen. So generally, and when you see older pictures of homes there, you would assume that people would want those homes torn down and fixed up, but they weren't fixed up. In fact, in some of the Culture Town interviews, it talks about how people were told, don't take your appliances, don't take anything, just we give you the money and you go. And of course, that was for people who owned their property. If they didn't own the property, if they were just renting, they didn't have any choices anyway. This is the Nazareth neighborhood. I don't know how many of you know that Nazareth was originally a Black neighborhood next to the Catholic orphanage, and it was purchased by the Pope family in the 1880s. And most of that is gone now. So by 1910, Idlewild was Black. Smoky Hollow, which had been a mixed community of mill and railroad workers, was becoming less mixed. When you looked on insurance maps, Black homes are listed as Negro shanties or tenements. And again, a lot of people were given space to live in the rear of the property. So it was considered elites, Black elites who lived on streets that were near the churches and public schools and colleges that employed them. These are some other housing pictures from Raleigh in the 1940s and 50s. So some of this is Smoky Hollow, some of this is Walnut, the area where Walnut Terrace was built. And you'll notice these houses are built on stilts. Now, consider what I said earlier. Raleigh was built with crisscross of creeks and watersheds. If your house was on the ground and water was going to run down whenever it rained, it would, your footings would get wet. So they put the houses on brick stilts so that they would not get wet. This is an old map of the 4th Ward neighborhood before urban renewal. So all of these streets and homes here were taken as part of that urban renewal process. The only thing that was left was Walnut Terrace. This is the 4th Ward neighborhood today. You notice Red Hat Amphitheater, but all of this area back in here, back to the MLK Bridge. When I was growing up, this was all houses, businesses, churches. It was a very much a thriving neighborhood. The Smoky Hollow neighborhood that was over by Cameron, by Clark Avenue, Peace Street, near Seaboard Station, that Smoky Hollow was called Smoky Hollow because of the smoke that hung over the, because you know it's down. So the smoke that would hover over the area because the railroad, the Raleigh and Gaston Railroad, went through there and was housed there. So this was all taken down. So it's all torn down. Capitol Boulevard was built, but this was houses and businesses as well. Most of the houses were for railroad workers, and most of the businesses had to do, they were foundries or planing mills or something to do with the railroad industry. This is Smoky Hollow today after urban renewal. And I took this map off of the Smoky Hollow website that deals with, that is part of the Kane development. So the Peace apartments and the Publix grocery store are here. There are 2 other apartment buildings here. And this is a future phase, and this is Capitol Boulevard. This is the area that is listed as the future Deborah Meadows Park. Of course, they are in the process, the city is in the process of deciding what to name that area as a park, but it is low-lying. So there are environmental and water issues there that have to be taken care of. Flood issues in Southeast Raleigh. This map here shows, so the dark blue is the Walnut Creek watershed. It's the creek itself, and all its little tributaries and stuff. This area on top is this area here is where Downtown South has been rezoned. This area over here is part of the Dix Park area. And then these yellow areas are where it floods regularly. This is Rochester Heights. This is over where off of Rose and Dacian Lane. And so on Garner Road, if you have ever driven down Garner Road, there's a little bridge, tiny little bridge. But look how it has the water holes already built in it. And that bridge has been there ever since I was a little girl. I would assume when Rochester Heights was built in the late 50s, this bridge was put there over this creek, over the Walnut Creek. This is after a hurricane. This is an apartment complex, a block before you get to the bridge. This area right here, and it took me a minute last night when I was going through my slides. I was like, what was that? That was actually homes. So right here is Old Garner Road, and these were homes. This is Hillcrest Cemetery back here. That's one of the older cemeteries in Raleigh, black cemeteries in Raleigh. But there were homes sitting here, and it was not considered. It was considered a 500-year floodplain. And after Hurricane Fran, this whole area flooded, and so FEMA bought these houses here. This down here, this bottom left, is a park that's in that area, and this is what it looks like after a heavy rainfall. Not after a hurricane, not after a big storm, just after a heavy rainfall. These are other areas that can be flooded or could be flooded. So this is on Bart Street, which is right off of, this is New Bern Avenue right here, and Pool Road, and this little corner right in here. That's what it looks like with just a couple of hours rain. And this is about 20 feet up off of a hill. You can see that. We actually think this is part of the fortification from the Civil War, the wall that was built around the city of Raleigh. But this is right on New Bern Avenue, and this is Battery Drive, which is where I live today. So this comes down. Sorry, let me go back. The water comes down back here and continues down back in here because there's a little tiny creek back there. So we still see lots of flooding. And then quickly, I want you to see what today's affordable housing looks like. This picture here is, I think, 2005, 2008. And then this is what it looked like in the early 2010, 2011. And this is what it looks like now. And the reason I shared these sets of pictures with you is because I had family who lived in this rental property. And I was afraid to go up on the porch. You see these poles that are here holding up what was, here. When I would get on the porch, walk on the porch, it would feel like it was falling in. But this was still able to be rented. And when my relative moved out of here, they moved across the street to an apartment. You can see how damaged it is and the water issues here. This was the front door, which is duct taped. The screen door is duct taped closed. This is a trailer complex in Southeast Raleigh. And you can see that there's water issues here. There's kudzu growing on the roof. But you look at the office. The office doesn't look bad. But this is what affordable housing looks like in Southeast Raleigh today. And I will say this trailer park is predominantly inhabited by not Native American, Latino and Hispanics. The other that I showed you earlier is primarily Black. This is the house that I showed you on the very first slide. Notice the corner of the house. This is just black mold, but it's still able to be rented and is rented. This house here on the top is a rooming house. And the young lady that I knew who lived there, she had a room for her and her 2 children. Everybody had a room. They shared the kitchen facilities. She was home one day and woke up surrounded by police officers because someone who lived in one of the rooms had been, was being looked for by the police. And she was scared out of her wits. So we helped her move. And this is what affordable housing also looks like today. Every major thoroughfare that comes in and out of the city of Raleigh has hotels that are full of people who don't have anywhere else to stay. And these are not, technically, these people are not considered homeless because they have somewhere to have a roof over their head. But we still have a good sized homeless population. And then these are different economic treatments in different neighborhoods. So this is an ABC store on New Bern Avenue. It's been here for, I don't know how many years. As long as I've been alive, there's been an ABC store there. This ABC store, when you go in, you cannot just go and look for what you want in the store. There is a plexiglass wall at the front, and there is someone standing there to tell them what you want to buy, and they go and get it and bring it to you. This house was under construction when I took the picture. It's finished now, but look at this house. Now, do you really think that the ABC store is going to stay there and stay like that? This is the ABC store in the Village District. My youngest daughter is 21. When she turned 21, she wanted to go to the ABC store. So she said, "Mama, take me." So we went. I felt like I was going in a department store. It was gorgeous. And it was set up, different areas, and you could walk all through it. The difference in neighborhoods makes a difference. Who lives in the neighborhood makes a difference. Economics is based on race. Down here, you see this old stone school supply warehouse, which was a thrift store and a bus garage when I was growing up. This is on Davie Street. Today, it's the Transfer Food Hall. So that is a huge change. And then all around the Transfer Food Hall are homes that I cannot, as a retired state employee, afford to buy. Let's look at the difference in power treatments. This is on Southeast Street. You'll at the corner of Southeast and Martin Luther King. This has been here as long as I can remember. This is an electrical storage house on New Bern Avenue. And there's houses on this side and that side. And then on the bottom, there's a house that I used to drive by all the time when I was growing up. And I wondered what it was. I just figured somebody had a nice house, but there wasn't anything else around it. And then a couple of years ago, I read an article and it says, this is an electrical storage house that the community fought for on Wade Avenue because they didn't want it to look like an electrical station. That doesn't happen in Black neighborhoods. Bridges are, and some of these things are just things you don't necessarily think about. But look at this concealing wall near Lake Boone Trail. It's a nice brick wall. The Black community, when they built 440 and cut through in between Rochester Heights and Biltmore Hills, they wanted a wall as well. This is what they got, a concrete wall. This is the concrete concealing wall right behind somebody's house. This is the same house. You can see the wall right there. This is Bailey Drive, which is a street that comes through between Rochester Heights and Biltmore Hills, that when I was growing up was all woods. And it's now got this bridge going across it, and there's nothing to conceal the homes. I know because I stood right there to take pictures. So this brings us to gentrification. So we went from annexation to urban renewal to gentrification. And the definition is the process where the character of a poor urban neighborhood is changed by wealthier people moving in, improving housing, attracting new businesses, typically displacing current inhabitants in the process. It comes from the British definition of landed gentry, and it was first used by a German-British sociologist to describe a shift when she would see a middle-class people moving into traditionally working-class neighborhoods. So I just want to show you a little bit of gentrification in downtown Raleigh. So this is the Winters Haven home for the elderly. This was built, I would say, in the early 70s by John Winters to make sure that the elderly had a place to live. Most of the apartments were one bedroom, it was a bedroom, a living room, and a small kitchen. That was bought about 3 years ago and transformed to what is now Capitol Flats Apartments. Winters Haven home, the apartment prices were, because of federal credits, held down, so they were affordable. This is one of those apartments redone, and I went back and checked last night. The rents are up to $1,200 for this kind of apartment now a month. I'm sure that the Winters Haven apartment rents were not more than $400 or $500. This is the 1100 block of South Blunt Street. So if you're driving past Shaw University and headed towards the highway, these three houses used to be on your left. These are the three houses that are there today. I don't have a heat map for the last census, so all of these heat maps have been moved, but this one, I just want you to kind of see, first of all, the racial change, and second of all, the number of people coming into our area. So this was the racial density map for 2000. Red was white and blue was black. And I don't know what these other colors were. That was 2000. In 2010, green was black, blue was white, red was, let me see if I can see. Red was Asian, yellow was Hispanic, and brown is other. So you can see our population has exploded, and our change, the numbers of people and the races of people are changing. They've taken this map down. I'm glad I already had it. So I made it through, I think. This is the bibliography of books and newspapers and things that I've used for research. And I'm happy if they want to post the, I can send a PDF and they can post that to the website if they would like to. So if you want to have access to some of this, you can. These are pictures and maps that I used. And this is the end of my presentation. If you like to follow me or contact me, here's all my information. I tend to post all kinds of stuff on Facebook about race and Black history. And I have just completed writing a book that is, I wrote that for Arcadia Press. If you ever are in the store and you see those little tiny books about Raleigh or Wake County or Cary, it's through that company. And I was very excited right before we got started because the proof for the book had just come in, and I printed that off. It is full of the information that I shared with you in more detail. There are pictures and maps and things that some people have not ever seen. With this information, it's called Historic Black Neighborhoods in Raleigh, and I will be taking pre-orders for that, but I don't have that part of my website set up yet. So if you are interested in pre-ordering or purchasing the book, if you will send your email to me at admin@researchandresource.com, I will send you a link to buy the book in October. And the books should be in before Christmas. They will not be on the shelves in the bookstores until the 9th of January. And so I'm going to stop sharing. And Yuri, you have some questions?
Wow, Carmen, thank you so much for this fantastic presentation. And I just went ahead and included your pre-order email address as well as your Carmen@researchandresource.com in the chat. I believe everyone can access that chat messages. So please do, everyone, contact her if you have questions that you come up after today's session, and go ahead and pre-order her book. Wow, this is amazing. So Carmen, while I wait for people to send me questions, I have a couple questions. So I know you've shared with us how the Black communities had been displaced for, oh my goodness, last how many years is that? Many decades, for various ways. And also you showed how unaffordable what was supposed to be affordable today So what happened to those Black communities? Where did they go? Um, how are they doing?
Um, I will say for some folk, people who were able to buy a home, they were also able to help their children if they wanted to go to college. We've been fortunate in Wake County to have had access to a lot of secondary education, starting with Wake Tech, and moving through. We've got 6 colleges here, 2 Black, William Peace, which was Peace College State. And so a lot of folks were able to go to school. If their parents had been able to go to school, they may have gone to one of the HBCUs, but a lot of people weren't. But because we were the capital city, we also had state government jobs for people in the 50s, 60s, 70s, and 80s. And so some people were able to make enough money to buy a house, to move out. But I think one of the things that I didn't suggest was the difference in the housing that you were able to start with. So after slavery ended, when the lots were divided, they were tiny. So you would look at a lot, and they did, that was deliberate because they were trying to cram as many folks in as they could. But most of the lot sizes did not change. So if you built a house on a lot that was less than a quarter of an acre, while it gave you some equity, it didn't give you much. So you couldn't make a lot of money off of that, as opposed to if you built a house in Oakwood, or if you moved into one of the white neighborhoods on the other side of town, where your house was on probably a larger piece of land, you weren't able to. So the inequity there keeps you from being able to make as much money, which may be part of the reason why we see so much gentrification today, because those families, this is a chance to get some money, not necessarily recognizing that where are you going to go after you get that money, because everything is that expensive now. But I know just take me, for instance. My parents were determined that I would do better than they did. My parents were middle class. My mother was a teacher. My father was a pharmacist, owned his own drugstore. His father was a pharmacist. And it took me a long time to realize that my family really is kind of upper middle class and Black. And so I didn't recognize that for a long time. But there are a lot of young people who didn't have that kind of advantage. Their parents were carpenters, they were masons. They were still able to make some money and to try to help push their children forward. And school wasn't anywhere near as expensive as it is today. So they could help. And then a lot of times those children would move out of town. They would go to where they could get a good job, and their parents would encourage them to do that. But there were still people who weren't able to. But as Raleigh has grown, some jobs have been available for people to take and be able to make some inroads. But when you say, you should have been able to pull yourself up by your bootstraps, if you're the first generation going to college, if you're the first generation that graduated from high school, you cannot go as far as someone who's got a family history of 3 or 4 generations of college, or has been able to sell property and make money. And so we don't always recognize the difference. If your family started to be able to make money after slavery, that's still 1863, 1963. It hasn't been 200 years. You don't have all the time that people had from the time that this nation was started. So there's a catch up. And when you were trying to catch up, you were still held behind because of how things were set up where housing was for Blacks, where law, where there were laws that said you can't move here, where there were things that said you can't do this, you can't go to this school. The other thing that I think about is when we desegregated the school systems here in the late 60s, the Black principals at the Black schools were told to get their best teachers and send their best teachers to the white schools to teach. The white principals were not told to get their best teachers to send to the Black schools to teach. Wonder why? Can you imagine if the best white teachers left Broughton and went to Ligon to teach? What kind of outcry there would have been? So, there are all these things that we don't necessarily think about, but they happened. And we have to consider them when we consider how we are moving forward past race. And when we are trying to clean up or make things better, literally, things are working the way they were set up to work. So we have to go back. We can't just patch stuff. We've got to go back and dig up, because the systems were created to do what they do. So when I talk to you about systemic racism, I'm saying the system was created to do what it is doing today. And we got to go and do something different than just fix it. You can't just tell a kid to learn how to read or expect a child to come to kindergarten already reading if their mom and dad are struggling to put food on the table, or that the table is in a hotel and there's 6 people living in that room. The reading part is not the most important part. You've got to learn how to survive before you've got a hunger to do the other. So there are so many places where we need to go and dig the roots up and figure out, let's dig this up. When the doctors come into you to work on, you got a health issue, they aren't starting just with the bandage. They go back to where the root of the issue is. And if they don't fix the root, then whatever the problem is going to continue to grow. And eventually it will kill you. So those are the things that we need to share in our communities. When I worked at the General Assembly, I remember reminding an appropriations chairman, just an observation for myself, that if children are able to run a drug empire, can you imagine what they could do in the business world? And so rather than just disciplining them or punishing them for what they're doing, those creative minds need to be focused in a different direction. You don't just slap those kids in jail. We don't just slap white kids in jail because they're doing stuff they aren't supposed to do. We figure out how to fix them. We send them to rehab. We do all of that kind of stuff. We don't do that with our Black and Hispanic children. And so really in every system, in every area, we need to go back to the roots and begin to dig things up.
Thank you, Carmen. There's several questions, and I feel some of them may be related to you, what you said now, but I'm just going to go in the order of how I received them. This is from Sarah Wilder. What change has worked and not worked to address this housing disparity?
I think you have me on my soapbox now. In Raleigh, we are considering, we've just passed, the city council just passed missing middle. And the thing that tends to be addressed is supply and demand from the economic side of things. And of course, with it being government, it takes a while to get through the process. So I live right off of New Bern Avenue. The prices over here have been crazy for 5 or 6 years. And now going down New Bern Avenue because of traffic, bus rapid transit, and the bus systems having more ridership over in this area for many years. This is the area where missing middle is focused. When you consider that as soon as property values started to climb, developers, many of whom don't live in this area, came in and bought the property. The people who lived in the affordable housing that was already here didn't have anywhere to go 4 or 5 years ago. So they had to go then. A lot of times you live in a rental house or a rental apartment, and the landlord doesn't come and tell you, I'm selling it and you're gonna have to move out. And so then you just have to go. Well, as the prices are climbing, most rental places want a last month's rent and a security deposit. If your rent that you had been paying was $500 a month, then that might be $1,500 you need to get together. But if there's nothing else in that range of pricing, apartments are $1,100 or $1,200 a month. A house might be that. That's $3,000 or more you need to put together. If you're having a hard time putting food on the table, if you're already working 2 jobs to make ends meet, you don't have any way to do that. And there's nobody giving out money to help do that. And so the city should assume some responsibility, or some organizations need to assume some responsibility, because these are our fellow people. These might be our children. These might be our sisters or brothers. There are church organizations that are across the country that would help set up those kinds of things if we allow them. We have to look further than just patching. And that's what we've been doing with our government. And with the changes, when you're making me go to the CAC changes, but when community engagement is dismantled and there is no way for the community to speak up and actually be heard or paid attention to, or ridiculed when they speak up, they're not going to talk. And some of the slides that I showed you, the apartment complex is going to go on the fortification wall, is actually going to be a 4-story, 40-unit apartment building, where the apartments are for sale. So they're micro units, and you may have heard about micro units with Kane's property, but he's planning to rent them. And his were 600 square feet. The ones that are going a half a block from me are 340 to 400 square feet. They're going to be for sale. And the last thing that the property owner said was they weren't sure what they would cost. But when he first came and talked to the neighborhood about it, they were going to be $250,000. This is not Pittsburgh. This is not New Jersey. This is not New York City. It might be in another 100 years, but not in the next 20. And a lot of these things are being built in the opportunity zones that were created by the overhaul of the tax law under President Trump. That opportunity zone law was co-sponsored by 2 Black senators, Tim Scott and Cory, I'm tired now. You know who I'm talking about, Senator Cory Booker. And their original plan for opportunity zones was for people who had money that was just sitting in accounts or in places where they were just drawing interest. That money could be turned over without having to pay taxes on it and go into areas that needed help to help the communities. That has not been done. And if you are familiar with the sausage making of law, lots and lots of changes occurred between the process of writing the bill, starting the writing of the bill, and what passed and was signed into law. So if you look at opportunity zone map in the city of Raleigh, and I did not put one of those in my presentation, it's mostly in Southeast Raleigh. So people who have money can buy the property for cheap and build what they want, because there are no rules saying what an opportunity zone has to be other than who chose it at the state government level. And there are no rules for a planning commission to say, this is in an opportunity zone. What is the opportunity that you are creating for the people who live in that area? And so things are not done in a way that is what was originally planned. And a lot of that land is now gone. You know, a lot of the places that are downtown Raleigh that were naturally occurring affordable housing are now $1 million apartments or condos. The fact that they were in an opportunity zone only created more wealth for those who were already wealthy. And those are things that we don't look at. And a lot of times when you look at the law, it's so jumbled, you can't figure out how to do that. So right now, I can't tell you what good things came because I don't see any. All I see is people who can't afford it being pushed out. And if I am in an area or if I see something coming, I am determined to let the people in that area know and try to help them figure out a way to voice their opinion, because I still find people are busy, people don't have time, and people don't understand a lot of what comes through in government. And so just because there's a little green and white sign on the ground that you can't hardly see when you're driving by or walking by doesn't mean you have time to do the research that it takes to figure out what is occurring in your community. And by the time you find out what's happening, the rezoning has already occurred, the city council has already voted on it, and you're just stuck. And sometimes that means that your property taxes are going to go up, or your house is going to, your property might be taken by eminent domain because infrastructure needs to be built. And it's just hard. You have to be able to chomp through, but nobody has time to go to all of these meetings and do it. So that's why we would depend on our council people to do those things. But I don't know how they have time to do all of it. I don't understand, just from watching the Planning Commission for the last 2 or 3 years, how they can read all the information that they get in order to make their decisions. And then to make decisions and have the city council ignore them half the time, that's just frustrating. So.
Thank you, Carmen. So I have a couple more questions, and one of them is about Dr. Wilman's work. This is from Fred Johnson. Did Dr. Wilmans explain why Black communities were located in the eastern part of the city? I've noticed this phenomenon in many cities across North Carolina.
So I think really part of what she said was that part of it was because those were the undesirable areas for white people. They generally had, I go in a little more depth in the book, but those were the places where the cemeteries were, where the industrial lands were. They were generally downhill, so they got wet. There was sewage. And I don't know if that's so for every city, but that was definitely the case for Raleigh. And those were the areas. So after the Civil War ended, a lot of the plantations folded. it was not just that they didn't have slaves to do the work anymore, but they had put so much of their money into the war, and then they lost. And then when the northern soldiers came through, they would take, they would take stuff. So sometimes, there was I think it was Governor Manley said in one of his letters that his farm, his estate out off of 64 near where Wake Med is, that the soldiers came through and like stripped everything. And if you go back and you'll read some of the WPA slave narratives that were done back in the 30s, where they had conversations with or interviews with former slaves, they talk about how they had to go hide food. They hid, they would dig holes and bury stuff. And then the soldiers would come and say, you need to tell us where it is. And they were being loyal to their slave owners. And so they wouldn't, because the slave owners had told them no. In fact, the slave owners would still tell them, you're still slaves. You're not free. So those lands were sold cheaply in a lot of cases because they had bills to pay, and those bills had to be paid. So if you sell this land that you're not using, and then the people who bought it would divide it into small plots. So that was kind of how that happened. But they weren't selling the best part of the land, because generally that's where their house was sitting.
Thank you. So Carmen, the last question is probably a good one, but please save a little bit of time so you can share about the Raleigh pilgrimage work that you do. So the last question is, what solution, this is from Andrea Phillips, what solutions would you propose for the housing displacement of communities of color? Are you aware of any comprehensive efforts on the part of the city of Raleigh to address gentrification and displacement? And I'm going to just go ahead and add, are there any citizens' effort also? Thank you.
Okay. So I was at a planning commission meeting a couple of weeks ago. There is a plan. The city, as you know, we passed the $80 million affordable housing bond 2 years ago, which was not enough money. It did not address the people who are at the bottom of the pot, because people who are making 30% AMI, and AMI, which is average median income in this area, average median income in our area is about $95,000 a year, which is much more than I as a retiree make. In order to make affordable housing profitable, it's generally housing at 80% of AMI, which would be about $75,000 salary per year. When you go below 50% AMI, especially when you go to 30% AMI, which is for people making about $25,000 a year, it's just not affordable. I mean, it's not practical if you are building to build and make any profit. You're going to have a loss. So you have to apply, if that's the type of development you do, for the LIHTC grants or LIHTC funds from the federal government. That's a year-long process, and it's not guaranteed that you'll get the money. So that already puts you behind the 8 ball in terms of when you are able to get money. So even if you're granted funds after that, and there are only 2 times a year, I believe, that you're able to apply, and the application process takes a while, and you don't find out, say you don't find out for another year that you're going to get the money, that money actually goes to the city, and then the city has to decide who they're going to give the money to. So you're looking at a 1.5-year process just to get the money, if you get it. And that already puts you behind where somebody else has already bought the land and built something and put it up. And people are not in business to do affordable housing. You know, some organizations are, and some organizations, there's an organization called Greystone that helps to fund these kinds of developments across the country. But it's hard to make money, and people are in business to make money. They don't go in business to be broke. So it is a long process, and the $80 million bond that we passed is going so many different places that there's not much left to actually build affordable housing. So there's conversation. There was a decision made by the council to buy a hotel and renovate that. There is land downtown. There are two pieces of land downtown that the city owns that are going to be used for affordable housing. One of them was before the Planning Commission the other day. It is, if you know where Mount Hope Cemetery is, it's when you are driving up the road away from Washington School, there is a wooded area between Fayetteville Street and Wilmington Street that has never been developed in the whole of the city's time. So since 1792, that area is a wetland. But that's an area they're now trying to rezone to use 9 acres of it for affordable housing. Well, I don't like that. It's the same thing that has always been done. Why are we putting people in an area that could flood, that nobody else has wanted to use to live in? And you know, it's just inherently unfair. It might solve a problem for a minute, but it's not going to solve it for long. And though, you know, we have to stop thinking that affordable housing has to go in a certain neighborhood. That's what we've been doing for hundreds of years, and it doesn't work. So I think I saw something in there in the chat about One Wake. One Wake, I know, has an affordable housing committee, and I know there are affordable housing developers in Raleigh. That's not all that they do, but there are some. And we just have to try, we really need to sit down and hammer that out. The community does, along with some of the developers who we know are doing that, because you can't expect, you know, when Kane built the Smoky Hollow development, he offered to put in maybe 10 affordable housing apartments. That's not enough, you know. And we have not cared for so long that it's going to be hard to catch up. I don't know that we'll ever catch up, but we have to do better to make an effort. And I don't know that they answered your question, but that's the best I got. I just keep talking to people who I know are doing these things to see what I can do to help. And I think all of us have to try to do that. Sometimes it's just a conversation. Sometimes it's connecting people who have some land. Sometimes it's, you know, reaching out to Habitat if you're in the process of doing your estate planning and saying, I've got 2 acres over here. Can you, you know, do you want it? I'll leave it to you instead of, and leave my kids what's in the bank account. You know, we have to think outside of the box when we're doing our things personally and when we're doing things community, in a community spirit.
Thank
So
you.
I want to really quickly tell you about the Raleigh Pilgrimage of Pain and Hope that I didn't know anything about a year ago this time, and had no intention when I was asked to work on this committee because I'm trying to learn how to say no. But a good friend of mine volunteered me to be on a committee. And I went to the meeting about whatever they were doing because I knew it had to do with race. I knew it had to do with history. And I said, well, I'll go sit and listen. And I was bubbly and overjoyed. It was like I found my crew at the end of this meeting. The Raleigh Pilgrimage of Pain and Hope is literally a pilgrimage. I don't know that any of you have ever taken a pilgrimage. I have not. I've gone on retreats. I've gone on conferences and workshops, but this is literally a 2.5-day commitment of yourself to explore Raleigh's history, its racial history. We start out on a Friday afternoon. We meet with, we'll be meeting starting at Mordecai. We will meet with someone from the Native American community who will talk to us about what it was like with Indigenous people before we started building here. And then we will have a tour of Mordecai with a docent. We will come back and we're going to head over to Chavis Park because we've decided that talking about slavery is pain, and we don't want to leave our people in pain on a Friday evening to get up on Saturday morning. So we'll go to Chavis and we'll talk about the history of Black Raleigh, and I will be doing that part of the conversation, and have a meal and reflect on what we learned that evening. Then we get up on Saturday morning. We're going to meet at Leonard Hall at Shaw University. I'm so excited because my grandfather was a pharmacy student at Leonard, and I had never been in the hall until last week. And we will hear from some folks at Shaw and talk about their history. And then we're going to take a walking tour of Shaw and downtown Raleigh and head to the City of Raleigh Museum, look at those exhibits, sit, contemplate, have lunch, contemplate some more. Then we will walk, those of us who are walking. If some people are not as ambulatory, so they'll be, having to drive and meet us places. But we're going to go to the city cemetery, which has a fascinating history. That 4-acre area, that 1 acre was for enslaved people, 1 acre was for people who came to Raleigh and died here, and 2 acres were for white people who lived here. We will take a Raleigh trolley, and do a tour of the downtown freedmen's villages, circling over to St. Augustine's. Somebody will get on the trolley at St. Augustine's and talk about the status of St. Augustine's, the college, the history. And then when they get off, we'll finish our tour of the freedmen's villages in that area. And we will head back to Shaw and have dinner and a discussion that evening. And this is based on Christian pilgrimage, but it is not just for Christians. And I do want to make that very clear. But we'll take some verses and read a verse, might be a sentence long, and then just let people ponder and reflect, because this is a life-changing journey. And then we will go on Sunday morning. We will attend church service at First Baptist, Black First Baptist downtown. We'll have a talking circle about what people have learned during the weekend and how it's changed them, what things they might see that they can do different in their life. And then we will go somewhere in the Oberlin community and have a panel discussion with Joe Holt, who is an Oberlin native, a Latina, and an Asian. And we will hear what they are having to deal with today in the Raleigh area, so that we kind of get a well-rounded view of the pain and hope that is in Raleigh. And then we'll finish up about 2:30 on Sunday and head out. So we are doing 2 soft launches this fall. Make sure that everything is going smoothly, and then we will start up probably February or March, doing this once a month. The tour is being handled right now, because we aren't a nonprofit yet, through the auspices of Christ the King Church on Person Street. We ask for donations. There is not a real cost. We are, trying to raise scholarship money, because we don't want anyone to want to go and not be able to participate. I went on the Durham pilgrimage last March, and I was flabbergasted. I mean, there's so much we don't know, and there's so much that's out there that's known, but we just don't know about it. And I knew Stagville was there, but I had never been to Stagville. As I told you, I spent a few years of my growing up time in Durham when my dad had a drugstore in Hayti. And so even though I'm back and forth to Durham all the time, my vision of Hayti is based on a little girl. And I can remember so many things that I heard my parents say that I really didn't understand or explore until I became an adult. And so it was amazing for some of the people who actually grew up in Durham, who were white, who didn't know anything about that part of the history of their town. And it changed them. You could see them change. You could hear it in their questions. And I believe that this Raleigh pilgrimage will do the same thing, not just for whites, but for Blacks, because as we get older and young folk are coming along, and the things that we might remember are completely gone, that there's nothing for them to hold on to. There's nothing for them to grasp and say, this is history, because for a lot of Black Raleigh, it has been torn down. It's not there anymore. And I also, one of the things I like to say is, if you don't have to sit in it, it doesn't make a difference to you. So you might hear about a shooting in Southeast Raleigh. I hear gunshots every night, every day. And my children have told me, you moved us to the hood. But I love where I am. I love the neighborhood. I love the character of it. And that's just something that has come with it. But I don't know all of those people's stories. I don't know why somebody feels like they have to rob somebody. Is it because they need a meal? How many times do I walk past somebody on the street who's asking for a handout, and I look at them, I don't want to give you any money, but I don't know. I don't know that they're going to buy wine. That's an assumption I make. And so I am growing in what I am learning in terms of how to treat people. And I think that's something that's hard to do, and something that you have to make a conscientious effort to do. And you have to make it every day, because tomorrow you might not feel like doing what you felt like doing today. And so that's all I got.
Well, thank you so much for your message that each one of us can do, even if what we can do may be a small step. So thank you so much, Carmen. And thank you so much for all of you who came and stayed until the end. And it looks like there are a lot of things we can do. The first step may be to pre-order her book. And this is the last community meeting of the ROAR this year, but there will be more coming in 2023. Nice meeting you all. Thank you.